If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. So welcome back to the podcast, and I am here with the one, the only, the inimitable.
Thank you.
You are inimitable.
I am.
Ed the Protestant.
Ed the Protestant.
And here
we are now. We are now inside for the duration.
Unfortunately, it is now in November.
Yeah.
And it is the kind of like the 5th season here by the shores of the Great Lake.
What do you mean by the 5th season?
Okay, so there's the 4 seasons, like spring, summer, autumn, and winter.
I'm familiar with the 4.
Okay, so here's the 5th season. Okay, let me put it this way. When I moved here, I had all my friends out in California and Arizona and warmer parts of the country say, how did you move to the shore of the Great Lake?
Yeah.
Because isn't it like, it's cold and in like the winter, how do you survive the winter? And what I said to them was, it wasn't the winter that bothered me because I like the snow. Snow's pretty and
right.
You can go out and play in the snow. You can go cross-country skiing and make snowmen and snow angels and go sledding and all that kind of fun stuff. I think it's fun to go out hiking in the snow and it's all pretty on the
right.
pine trees out, whatever. It isn't the winter, the snow that bothers me here. It's the 5th season. And the 5th season is the 6 weeks of cold, rainy, slushy.
Right.
That you get 6 weeks of it like right now, which is like the 1st of November to like mid-December before the snow comes.
Right.
There's 6 weeks where it's like right now outside, it's 40 degrees.
Yeah. And it's going to rain in a couple hours.
It was raining earlier, and so it's wet, and it's rainy,
it's gloomy.
And gloomy, and it's 40 degrees, and there's a wind off that lake, that Great Lake, and that wind with the wind chill just cuts, and so you go outside, and it's wet and cold and gloomy, okay? And there's 6 weeks of that from like the 1st of November to like early to mid-December.
Yep.
Then you get 6 more weeks of it, because the snow all melts and like the 1st of March, like March to mid-April is 6 more weeks. So if you think about it, that's 12 weeks a year.
Right.
Okay. 12 weeks a year. That's like what? Like 4 months, right? Of the year is just cold, wet, windy, gloomy.
Right.
That's what I call the 5th season. And the 4 seasons are beautiful, including the winter. But it's this. And I have a backstory about it, okay? Because this particular town was founded by Dutch immigrants in the early 1800s, okay?
Yep.
But the particular Dutch immigrants that founded this town, they came from a part of the Netherlands that was on the North Sea. Mm. And the story is they came to the United States, as immigrants did in the 19th century, and they came here and the government was giving out like land grants out in the wilderness. And so they traveled over here and it was all like trees and bears and Indians and stuff like that. And apparently they came to the shore of this Great Lake and it was like this time of year or something. And they were like, this reminds us of our home on the North Sea.
Right.
In the Netherlands. We feel totally at home here.
As if anybody who lived on the North Sea wouldn't be trying to get out of it.
Well, you thought they had. They'd left and they came here and they found, we found a place that reminds us of the cold, bleak shores of the North Sea, and this is where we'll settle and build a town. And now here we are.
See, this explains why, like they say of the English, that they take their pleasures sadly.
That's right. That's right. No, I think this is a wonderful place to live, and the 4 seasons are great. But this is why we can't have nice things. This is why we can't be out at the secret compound right now. I'd actually go out there in the winter all the time. We've done fire pit out there in the winter, but now it's just everything is wet and gloomy and windy and cold and anyway.
Yeah.
So we have retreated indoors.
And I'm just back from 2 weeks out west where it was mostly very warm and nice, and I got used to it like immediately.
Yeah.
Like when I feel the air between the airplane door and the jetway, that's how long it takes me to get used to it being warm.
Yeah. We were out in California, my old stomping ground.
I was in Washington State and Phoenix and Tucson and
Wow. So anyway, here we are, and we're sitting indoors, and you had something that you wanted to ask about Catholicism and all that. And since this is the Considering Catholicism podcast, why don't you ask what you're going to ask, Ed, and we'll see if we can answer.
All right. We were talking a couple of weeks ago or recently, whenever, on the podcast about the Mass and the origins of the Mass. You said something that really stuck with me. You said that in the modern world, Protestant world, the modern world, casual equals authentic. Mm-hmm. And that really, I thought a lot about that. I thought, I'm a really casual guy. I look better. I'm the only person I know who looks better on laundry day. Because all of my casual, I have to wear the good stuff because everything else is in the wash.
You are a very casual guy.
I'm a very casual guy. And I carried that I thought that all my life about church. That casual was more authentic, and that's how we should do church, to borrow a phrase I don't like anymore.
Yeah.
And so you and I talked about that, how we were casual on stage, and we thought that was just more authentic.
You're being real.
Being real. And now I think about so that spun me off into thinking about the Catholic Church and cathedrals and all these really great places. And you open the podcast, if you hunger or if you crave truth and beauty and goodness. And those, for maybe the first year I was doing the podcast or even longer, I just thought, do I know anybody who hungers for truth, goodness, and beauty? And then now I'm thinking like maybe I do. We've talked about this a lot, but I'm tired of cold architecture. I'm tired of watching people around me get involved in things that really aren't good for them. People who don't, I just read a Carl Sagan quote who said that he was afraid that for future generations that they wouldn't know, see if I can get this right, that they wouldn't know the difference between what felt good and what was true. Okay. And I see increasing amounts of this. And now I'm beginning to see what the world lost when it lost Christendom and its influence and the influence of God in the world. My oldest daughter graduated from Evergreen College in Olympia, Washington, which is a bastion of progressivism. And the buildings were all these bare concrete block thingies. And I said, are they ever going to paint this? And she said, no, Dad, this is brutalism. And I said, it's ugly. And she said, and here we go to my point. She said, Dad, you think it's ugly. And I remember thinking, no, there has to be objective beauty and objective goodness and objective truth. And I increasingly feel like Catholicism offers way more of this than I would ever get anyplace else. So I would like to, let's talk about that. Catholicism and truth and goodness and beauty. I know that's an ancient, those are ancient virtues or
indeed
ancient things.
Yeah, let's talk about this. In fact, I think this will probably end up being a little bit of a two-part conversation today because I want to subject everybody to a little bit of a theological, philosophical discussion of this first.
I love that stuff.
Okay.
Well, have at it.
I'm glad you do. Because these three words, truth and goodness and beauty, or the true, the good, and the beautiful, are essential. And I mean that literally. They are essential to Catholic theology, Catholic doctrine. They're cited in all kinds of Catholic magisterial doctrinal documents, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. They're a huge part of Catholic theology and have been for 2,000 years. So I want to get to the practical stuff like the ugly buildings or beautiful buildings and all that. But let's start by laying the philosophical groundwork.
Yep.
And I'm going to try to restrain myself from making this too long or too boring because actually what I got my undergraduate degree in was history of philosophy, specializing on ancient and medieval philosophy.
Okay.
This is like my thing. Like I could talk about this for a
Right.
really long time. And what I have found is in social situations, most people are not as interested in this as I am.
And me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
People's
Oh,
eyes roll back. And,
yeah, like my wife steps on my foot under the table if I start talking about this stuff. Okay, so here's the deal. I'm trying to make it succinct, and then we can get on to that. These things, truth, goodness, and beauty, or the true, the good, and the beautiful, they have a term in theology, classical theology, called the transcendentals.
okay.
Okay, the transcendentals, transcendent.
Right.
And that these are the three not as an adjective, but as nouns. There are these transcendental qualities.
Yeah.
Okay. But they're even more than that. They're transcendental realities. And so you can refer to the in fact, if you go and you Google or Wiki or something, the transcendentals, it'll come up as truth, goodness, and beauty. So let me explain where that comes from. It goes back to the first time that this gets discussed is in Greek philosophy,
Yep.
pre-Christian Greek philosophy. So if you go back to the philosophical foundations are in Plato and Aristotle.
Okay.
And not just in them, but because there was talked a lot about in Greek philosophy, but primarily let's stick with those are the big names that
Okay.
everybody recognizes. Plato and Aristotle. And to put that in context, Plato and Aristotle are writing about, 400 years before Christ, 350, 400 years
Okay.
before Jesus in Greece and Athens. Okay. And Plato came first. Aristotle was a generation later. And Plato was a student of a guy named Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
And Socrates didn't actually write anything down. Plato wrote down what Socrates said and added to it. Okay. And then Aristotle came along like a generation later. So Plato starts to originate this idea, or starts to emerge in that of the three transcendentals, truth and goodness and beauty, the true, the good, and the beautiful. In Catholic theology, these are given Latin words. So truth is verum,
Mm-hmm.
V-E-R-U-M, like
Yeah.
veritas is truth in Latin. So you get passages, remember when you would have the old King James, it would say, verily, verily,
Yeah.
I say unto you, and then
Right.
you'd have more modern translations, it would be truly,
Yeah.
because the Latin was veritas.
Yep.
So that's truth. And then bonum or bonum is the Latin term for goodness or the good.
Okay.
Okay. And you get words with
Like Bon Voyage.
by Bon Voyage or the singer Bono,
Right.
who in a pretentious way
Right.
named himself Good Voice, or I think Bono Voce was like original.
Oh,
whatever,
okay.
Super pretentious. But anyway, and those are and then the word for good in Latin was pulchrum, which is but the Greek words, because Aristotle and Plato obviously wrote in Greek, so the Greek word for truth was aletheia. And then goodness in Greek was agatha or agathon,
Okay.
which is where we get the word Agatha, like a name.
Right.
But you don't think of it, which means pretty or beautiful when I think of that. So anyway, the point is that these words had Greek and Latin roots because as the church translated into Latin, whatever. Here's the idea. Plato had this whole idea of transcendent realities, that there were real things, ideals. For example, if you think about for Plato's ideals, you might say, Plato might say there's a thing called a circle. And there's the ideal circle, the perfect circle. And the perfect circle exists in this world of the ideals. There's like a transcendent reality where there are
Right.
the perfect forms of things.
Yeah.
The perfect circle, the perfect square, the ideal chair, the ideal guitar, the ideal this. And then what he said is, in the world that we live in, there are shadows that are diminished. We live in the shadowlands in which we don't really see the ideal forms of things. We only see shadows of them. And there's this famous analogy that most people have heard if they've ever taken like a philosophy class or whatever, of Plato's analogy of the cave.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Right?
Yep.
So he had this whole thing, without wasting too much time on this, where imagine there's this cave underground for some reason, and the cave is set up like a theater where it's got these seats in it. And there's these people that for some reason have been stuck in these seats from the moment of birth.
Right.
So they've never been out of the cave, and they can't turn their heads. All they've been able to do is for some reason somebody stuck them in this chair,
right,
and fixed their head to stare at like the screen ahead of them, the wall ahead of them. I don't know how they go to the bathroom or whatever. Don't think too much about that sort of thing. But anyway, they're stuck in this thing, and they look at this, and then what happens is behind them there's like a bonfire, and then there are people who make little shapes that shine up on the wall. So basically what they see is like silhouettes.
Right.
So there's people behind them walking in front of the bonfire, and they've got, or they're making like little hand animals, like hand rabbits and stuff like that shine up there. And then the people sitting in the chairs, all they've ever known are these two-dimensional silhouettes of things. And they would name them. They go, oh, that looks like a rabbit, or that looks like a this or that. But all they've ever known are the two-dimensional things. And then Plato says, imagine you take one of those people that's been stuck in that his whole life, and you take them out of the cave and you take them up to the surface world. And they see all of a sudden the three-dimensional world with color and all of this, and it will blow their mind.
Yeah.
Because all they've ever known are shadows of the real world, not the real world itself. And so Plato says there is this transcendent realm, and among the things that are in this transcendent realm are the true and the good and the beautiful. And all we've ever seen are diminished shadows of what is ultimately true, what is ultimately good, and what is ultimately beautiful. Am I making sense?
Yeah, but that stuff is out there, right?
It's up there.
Up there.
It's up there. There's these ideals. And Plato didn't know really where to go with it, because this is 350, 400 years before Christ. And so the Greeks were trying to grasp at truth, but they didn't have all the truth.
Right.
And they sensed that there are, and Plato sensed, Socrates and Plato, that there are these sort of ideals, these transcendent realities, and that the ultimate forms of them are what is ultimately true and ultimately good and ultimately beautiful. And so Plato says truth is intelligence, it's mind, it's it's the ability to form thought, to be intelligent, to be coherent, to give will to that. Mm-hmm. That's the ultimate thing of what he called the truth. And then the good for Plato is the ideal form of the virtues carried out to their perfection. Mm-hmm. And then the beautiful is the ideal proportion of things. So that was like where the Greeks, like where they would like design their buildings, the Parthenon or something like that. Yeah. And it's all these ideal proportions, because their idea, or Plato's idea, was that there's this ultimate transcendent realm in which everything is of ideal proportion and beauty. And then what we're doing down here in this world and the Shadowlands is we're trying to the best we can, trying to form replicas of these things, imperfect replicas of the ultimate mind and will, the imperfect replicas of the ultimate virtues, imperfect replicas of the ultimate proportions that make things beautiful.
I just read a book about Da Vinci, and he was into that. The Vitruvian Man, I think, the guy with inside the circle.
Yeah, Vitruvian Man,
and other things. He was always looking for those ratios that, you know.
Exactly. The naked guy in the circle, right? Yeah. And the Vitruvian Man, and that was exactly right. In fact, Vitruvius, who was the Latin philosopher who the Vitruvian Man comes from, it was all about perfect proportions. And then you look at the golden ratios, and the truths of geometry. This all comes out of that notion of, in Greek philosophy, that there's these sort of ultimate perfect ratios, perfect realities, perfect truths, the truths of mathematics, truths of geometry, and that all these things together form these ultimate, the ultimate forms of intelligence, of proportion, virtue, and that all we have in this world, like the guys in the cave, are some sort of imperfect shadows of these things. Okay, you with me?
Yep.
All right. Then Aristotle, the philosopher Aristotle, comes along a generation later, and he says, no, Plato's kind of got it half right, but half wrong. Because there are these things, truth and goodness and beauty, but they don't come from above. Aristotle saw them coming from below. So he says things that are round. And then if you imagine, okay, here's your coffee cup, and it's round, but it's not perfectly round. I'm sure if we got in some kind of like measuring device, we could find imperfections in it.
Right.
But he said, if you imagined that from the imperfect, you could reach the ultimate perfection of roundness. So, okay, bring this together with Catholicism in an interesting way. If you go to the Vatican, okay, in Rome, right, St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican, where the Pope lives, and you're going to take the tour through the Vatican museums, and you're going to go into the Sistine Chapel where Michelangelo painted the ceiling and all that. Which, by the way, that whole design of the Sistine Chapel was premised on ideal proportions and everything else.
Oh, okay.
And this whole long story. So the Sistine Chapel was designed to be the exact proportions of David's temple, or of Solomon's temple.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because in the Bible it specified the proportions or the measurements of Solomon's temple.
Yep.
So when the Sistine Chapel was built, it was meant to replicate the proportions of Solomon's temple. Anyway, if you're going to take that tour, before you get to the Sistine Chapel, you'll go through these rooms called the Raphael rooms. And this was the artist Raphael, who was a contemporary of Michelangelo. And he painted all these beautiful frescoes on these walls and these kind of rooms adjacent to the Sistine Chapel. And one of them is a very famous painting. You can find it online, called The School of Athens. And what it shows is all of these philosophers and mathematicians and all the Greek wise people in the pre-Christian era. And in the center of it are two guys walking, and then you see all these other guys around them, like this is Euclid, who came up with geometry and this and this and that. But the two guys in the center are walking along, and they're like having a discussion or an argument. And the one guy is pointing his finger up while he's gesturing. The other guy is gesturing with his finger up. And the guy next to him is arguing with him in a toga. And he's making a gesture pointing down. And what it is Raphael intended, one is Plato and one is Aristotle, because he said Plato was always looking up to what was above, and Aristotle was always looking down to what was below. But the two sort of meet in the middle on this idea that we are intuitively, as human beings, we intuitively sense that there is an ultimate truth and an ultimate goodness and an ultimate beauty. And we can have these philosophical discussions about what they mean. Okay. So now somebody's listening to this and they're like, what does any of this have to do with Catholicism, and how do you get from Plato and Aristotle to the Catholic Church and all that? Well, here's the thing. When Christ comes along, right from the first generation of the apostles, they live in this world where, Greek philosophy and Greek thought surrounded them. That's why they wrote the New Testament in Greek. Right? And right away, they began to borrow isn't the right word, but recognize the truths that were there before Christ, the sort of pre-Christian truths, that how those pre-Christian truths foretold the truths that were more perfectly revealed in Jesus.
Okay.
And now I know there's some evangelicals go, this is all terrible Catholic whatever, and it's all Catholic mumbo jumbo and syncretism with Greek philosophy and blah, 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 and all we need is the Bible and the Jews and the Old Testament. Well, here's why they're wrong, right? So right in the New Testament, you have these ideas that I'm talking about from the pre-Christian Greeks. You have them right there, how the apostles from the beginning began to understand that God in his providence had spoken to and allowed people prior to Christ, even the Greek philosophers, to sense some of the truth, but they didn't have the whole truth. And I'll give you two instances, okay? One is from the book of the Gospel of John, right in the Gospel of John. Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. Now, it doesn't say word because the Gospel of John, like the rest of the New Testament, was written in Greek. What it says in Greek is, in the beginning was the Logos, which is a word out of Greek philosophy that means something like the truth. It is the divine word, the divine intelligence married to will, the divine mind, if you might. And there were all of these things floating around in Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, all this stuff, about they sensed there was an ultimate mind, an ultimate intelligence, an ultimate will behind the universe, that all things were formed according to and by. Because they could look around and they'd say, hey, look, it's obvious that the universe was created, that it was designed, there's an ultimate designer, there's an ultimate intelligence and mind and will behind it. And they used this term logos. So when the Gospel of John is written, when John, the apostle of Jesus, comes along and says, let me tell you, in the beginning was the Logos, he's borrowing this word from Greek philosophy.
Okay.
And he's saying what the Greeks, like Plato and Aristotle, as philosophers, sensed is that there was an ultimate intelligence and will behind the universe or above the universe or from which the universe spread and is organized by. And he says, we now know because of the revelation in Jesus who and what that was. And that ultimate thing, that logos that the Greeks talked about.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And it was born in Jesus Christ. So what John was saying is that the Greeks sensed that there was truth, and they didn't have all of the clues, right? They're like detectives going, you're a detective, and you go, okay, you come to the crime scene, and you've got, here's a scrap of paper, and here's a this, and there's an overturned wine glass, and here's all the little clues, but we just don't know how to put it all, we're missing something to put it together and figure it all out and solve it. The early Christians from the apostles on said those Greek philosophers sensed they had a lot of the clues, and they sensed there was something there, but they didn't have the final piece of information to pull it all together, and we do because of the birth of Christ and then his life, death, and resurrection. And they said, now we can understand that thing that the Greek philosophers were talking about, the Logos, and understand that what that really is, that mind, that will, that intelligence by which the universe is formed and created. Because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything that was made, nothing was made except through that Logos.
Yeah.
He says, now we understand it because we have the revelation in Christ.
That's interesting,
that helps us to put it together. We have the missing piece of information.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Second instance from the New Testament. Acts, I think it's 17, Paul goes to Athens, Greece.
Yeah.
And he goes to the Areopagus, the Mars Hill there. He goes to the town square underneath the Parthenon where all the philosophers hang out. And Paul gives a sermon to them. And he says, you Greek philosophers, go read it in Acts 17, you have sensed so much of the truth. And he begins to share the gospel with them. You guys you're so close. You put together, you've got all the clues, and you've almost been able to put together, but you can't quite solve the riddle because there's a piece that you're missing. And he tells them about Jesus Christ and, the life, death, and resurrection. And he goes, that's a part that that pulls everything together. Okay. So I said I wasn't going to make this boring. So here's the deal. The Greek philosophers understood that there was this ultimate truth and this ultimate goodness and this ultimate beauty that is behind the universe, this ultimate intelligence, this ultimate virtue, this ultimate sense of proportion and balance. And what happened is with the apostles and then the early Christian fathers, they go, now through the revelation of Christ, we know how to put that together. And what we understand is that those are inherent qualities of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay? He's the thing that's ultimately true. He's the ultimate verum. He's the ultimate bonum. He's the ultimate pulchrum. Those are intrinsic or inherent properties of God.
Okay.
And because of that, they are projected, like, remember as the analogy of the cave I talked about a few minutes ago with Plato?
Yep.
The silhouettes, the shadowlands. Because he's the creator, those intrinsic properties or qualities in him are projected onto everything he makes. If you're going to be like a potter and you're going to make something out of clay, or you're going to be a painter, or whatever you're going to make, some aspect of yourself passes into that.
Yeah.
Your fingerprints are all over it.
Right.
And so because God is the ultimate verum and bonum and pulchrum, all of those qualities are his intrinsic properties, his fingerprints are all over everything he's made in this universe.
Right.
And so there are these residual aspects of truth and goodness and beauty that we see in the universe, the created universe, we see in life, we see in the natural law, and we can sense them, even if we, like the Greek philosophers before Jesus, even if we don't really understand them, we sense them. We know that there's truth, we know there's goodness, and we know there's beauty. And we are made for them. That's why I say at the beginning of this podcast and the intro all the time, if you ache for those things, for truth and goodness, because those are the things that we were made as creations of God. We were made for them. The creature longs for its creator.
Right.
And just like a child would long for its mother or father because he has or she has their DNA in them, we as creations of God long to be reunited with the ultimate mind and will and proportion and balance and virtue of God.
Right.
The truth and goodness and beauty, the true and the good and the beautiful. Right. It's built into us that we want to be reunited with that.
Right.
And so we find ourselves longing for it, and we can see bits and pieces of it in the universe, in our lives, in natural law. We see those and we go, oh, yeah. Our hearts will only be content when we get to those. And the only way to get to them is to follow them back to their source.
Right.
And their source is in God himself, in the Holy Trinity, in God, right? So that's why I always say on the podcast that the way it works is if you start to follow anything that's true, if you follow any truth,
right,
and you follow it back to its source. So you find something that is true, and it could be anything. It can be intelligence, wit, will.
Right.
It can be truths of mathematics. Right? When you find that and you start following the chain of causality,
right,
it will ultimately lead you back to the ultimate source of truth and the true, which is God. And the same thing with goodness and beauty. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, not only are the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, intrinsic properties of God, they are pathways to him. It doesn't matter. Anything that is good, that's genuinely good, if you follow that to its ultimate source,
right,
it will lead you to God. If you follow anything that's beautiful, if you desire those things, they will all lead you back to the one true God, to the Holy Trinity, and they will all lead you back to Christ, the divine Logos, through which all things were made.
So the beautiful cathedrals are there to pull us up, to draw us in.
Yeah. And we're going to get in this in the second part of this conversation, because so much of the Catholic life and Catholic art and Catholic thought and Catholic culture and Catholic history is recognizing those things and creating opportunities and moments for us to find them and be drawn to them.
Yeah.
But it also goes back to a conversation that Corey and I had a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about, can people outside the church find God? Can be saved,
right,
outside the church and through other religions? And you can go back and listen to that episode. But basically the answer is there is no salvation. There's only one salvation. It comes through Jesus Christ. But people can get to Christ through a lot of different routes. So routes like in routes, right? There's a lot of different pathways that can lead you back to Christ. So even somebody who is an agnostic or an atheist, or the kid in Mongolia 1,000 years ago who never, heard the gospel, or somebody who's in another religion, that other religion doesn't save them. But to the extent that in their world they found a true thing or a good thing or a beautiful thing,
right,
if they pursue it, it will bring them back to that source. And so much of Catholicism, again, and the Catholic worldview, culture, art, whatever, is about holding those things up and making those pathways clear to people. But I don't know if I'm making sense in all this, but that's what the idea is. The transcendentals are the three intrinsic properties of God.
Right.
And they are imprinted on all that he has made. And so we have, even in shadow form, little bits and pieces of his DNA, if you would, impressed into his creation, his fingerprints. And that if we will follow those fingerprints, follow the clues, they will all lead us back to God. And that there's a lot of ways to get to Christ and get to God. And sometimes we can talk, and we'll talk about this in the next conversation, about the way of goodness and the way of truth and the way of beauty, which is somebody following one of those things back to their source.
Okay. That good stuff. I have I have nothing to add.
Yeah.
Looking forward to the second conversation.
Okay. So we'll wrap this here and spared you from getting into the medieval thinkers and Thomas Aquinas and all that. You've been spared of all of that, but that's the big idea. Hey, we're going to take a break here, and then we're going to talk about how this plays out in life and how it plays out in the Catholic life and how that maybe is a little bit different than it is in the evangelical world. Okay?
Yeah.
Hey, if you're listening, we really appreciate your support and your listenership and your enthusiasm and all that. Would you rate and review the podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever? Give us a rating, write us a review. You can go to the website, consideringcatholicism.com, write a review there, write an Apple Podcast. Send us your questions and comments, consideringcatholicism@gmail.com. And if you're in your charity, you would be willing to support the podcast, that allows us to keep this thing going for as long as we possibly can and to do more. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to talk about how truth and goodness and beauty play out in the practical terms of the Catholic life. Okay.